Logan. Welcome back. We were just finishing talking about cross-sectional versus longitudinal designs and moving into talking about between group versus within group study designs. And so what we're looking at here, or the differences here, are if we're looking at changes between participants or between a group of participants versus a change within those participants or within that group of participants. So when clinical psychologists are conducting a study with a between group design, participants in different conditions are receiving different treatments. So that would be the experimental condition or the experimental group and the control condition or the control group. The between group designs typically involve a comparison of a control to an experimental group, whereas the within group designs typically involve a comparison of the same group to itself at a different point in time. So if we consider an example that was used in your book that's helpful on making this point is on the relationship or a study on the relationship between exercise and depression. So for a between group design, a clinical psychology researcher, after taking a baseline measure of depression of all participants at the very beginning, is assigning some participants to condition A and some to B. For in condition A, those participants are following an exercise regimen over 8 weeks, and then B, they're not following an exercise regimen. And then the question here that they're trying to answer is whether changes in depression from pre to post test are depending on whether the person was assigned to condition A versus condition B. Versus a within group design, which involves comparisons of participants in a single condition to themselves at various points in time. So in this design, all participants are experiencing the same condition or conditions. The researcher would introduce all participants to the exercise regimen lasting 8 weeks and could compare depression levels each week from start to finish. And so the question here isn't on the condition A versus condition B, but is whether the changes in depression levels depend on the point in time in which depression is assessed. So sometimes clinical psychology researchers will actually combine aspects of between and within group designs and create something called a mixed group design. And so in that exercise and depression study example, the researcher could merge those approaches to studying exercise and depression by assigning participants to two conditions, the exercise versus no exercise, and then doing a frequent follow-up or frequent measurement of those depression symptoms on a weekly basis. And then at the end of the study, they would be able to compare the two groups and would also be able to compare that group A to itself over time. And so that's more information. It's controlling for more. It's a more rigorous study. It's also at the same time more complicated. It would require larger sample sizes and it's more expensive to conduct. And so while it's the quote unquote strongest of the designs, it's not always indicated to use that and would again depend on the research question. Okay, so next I want to go over something called an analog design. So this is used by clinical psychologists when they want to study clinical populations or situations and they aren't able to access them adequately otherwise. And so an analog study is involving an approximation of the target client or situation as a substitute for the real thing. And so sometimes it can involve using participants whose characteristics resemble but don't exactly match those of the target population, or of asking participants to remember themselves in a certain situation. So an example there on the slide is remember a day when you felt really low and then answer these questions. Another example is using ice water as an analog for pain. You put your arm into a bucket of ice water, it is immediately uncomfortable and over time actually becomes quite painful. And so if a clinical psychology researcher wanted to study a process within the context of pain, they might use ice water as a part of the study as an analog for pain. If we go back to that depression and physical exercise example, we could also frame that within an analog design here. Like if researchers were primarily interested in the relationship of physical exercise to severely depressed individuals, but they didn't have access to a severely depressed population, they might instead use a more available population, like college undergrads, that are experiencing or reporting a mild to moderate level of depression and see if more exercise leads to fewer symptoms in that population. Of course, when they report these results, what they should be reporting is not that it would translate the exact same way in a severely depressed population, but would in all likelihood actually conclude that the results need to be replicated again in a severely depressed population or in a severely depressed sample. And but that was still useful in getting you to that next step. And so this kind of study design it's useful when it's not practical to study a clinical phenomenon as it's happening, and when they can use an analog, or they could use an analog study when the situation can be simulated in the lab. Okay. Clinical psychology researchers often conduct correlational studies as well, particularly when neither an experiment or a quasi-experimental method is plausible. Studies that use correlation methods are examining relationships that exist between two or more variables, but they're not identifying independent versus dependent variables here. And so causality can't be implied. And so just because we're saying that one of these things can predict or kind of associate with another, we're never able to say that one variable is causing another. So to contextualize this with an example, in one correlational study, researchers examined therapy outcomes of more than 2,000 clients over a 5-year period who had taken sick leave from their jobs for mental health concerns like depression or anxiety. And what they found was a significant positive correlation between the amount of time that clients waited to take sick leave and the amount of time that the clients stayed on the sick leave. So what that means is those who got into therapy sooner got back to work sooner, and those who started therapy later got back to work later. And so it might seem like one of those variables is causing the other, but the reality is that either one of them could cause the other, and even that a third variable could have led to changes in both of them. Like, considering, for an example, if the person had a really strong social support system, both at work and at home, well, if they had a very supportive supervisor or boss who encouraged them to take off time sooner, and a very supportive family member who was setting up the rest of their home life in order to support their mental health, then that social support could have influenced both them taking time off sooner and being able to get back to work sooner, as one example. So these correlational studies can constitute important early steps in an evolution of research on a particular topic, and that would eventually lead to more experimental or quasi-experimental designs. They're often, I shouldn't say often, they're also sometimes the only method that is available for certain research areas. Like if we were wanting to look at factors that are associated with completed suicides, that's something that we can't look at until after the fact. And so that has to be done with correlational study methods. Okay. Moving on now to case studies. So unlike the methods that we've reviewed so far that involve a large number of participants, case studies are involving a thorough and a detailed examination of either one person or one situation. And so typically they involve descriptive observations of an individual's behavior and then the researcher's attempts to interpret that behavior. They may also speculate about how explanations about that target individual may then be applied to others who are similar in some kind of way. And so case studies can also stimulate more systematic research. And then together, the forms of research can converge on important findings. And so there's one really great example of this in your book that talks about a doctor in the mid-1960s, which was during a time when obsessive compulsive disorder was considered essentially untreatable. This Dr. Victor Meyer published a series of case studies in which he described successful treatment of patients with OCD that emphasized exposure to the stimulus that caused anxiety and then prevention of the behavior that would reduce anxiety. And so the person's coming in obsessed with dirt and cleanliness. This doctor exposes them to dirt and then doesn't allow them to wash their hands, and then points out, hey, nothing really bad happened when you weren't able to wash your hands. What do you think that means? And so this then led to his publishing of these case studies, then led to the development of more experimental studies, and was the catalyst for what is now the go-to standard for treatment for OCD, which is called exposure and response prevention. But it was kind of the combination of the case studies that gave enough traction for the experimental studies to come in and then to converge together to offer forward this treatment that would work well in this client population. So in this way, case studies alone have limited generalizability, but they are able to provide important clinical information that can lead to more large-scale research. Case studies are largely, or they're held in high regard for researchers that prefer what's called an idiographic approach, which is emphasizing or revealing the unique qualities of each person. And so they are regarded, this kind of study is regarded by researchers that like idiographic versus nomothetic, which is determining similarities or common qualities across people. Sometimes case studies are qualitative in nature, like having a really detailed write-up of a case, and sometimes they can feature some experimental qualities, like focusing on a person at different time points, or using some version of an A-B design, like exposure to that treatment, taking the treatment away, starting the treatment again, taking the treatment away, where A and B are each representing the presence or absence of that treatment. So that's case studies. And meta-analysis is another form of research study that clinical psychologists will conduct. So meta-analysis is a statistical method of combining results of separate studies that are all trying to answer the same research question, and then it creates a summary of those findings that's in a statistical test or in a score. And so it is a quantitative analysis in which the full results of previous studies each represent a small part of the larger pool of data that is presented in the meta-analysis. So if we think about what the rationale for a meta-analysis is, it can be informative to read the results of a single study on, say, the benefits of psychotherapy, but it can be far more beneficial or enlightening to read a meta-analysis on the topic, because it's encompassing many comparable studies that are all trying to answer the same question. And so our support for cognitive behavior therapy actually comes from meta-analyses. There have been so many studies on cognitive behavior therapy that now we're able to do more than one meta-analysis on cognitive behavior therapy, and that is providing enough support, and it gives us the confidence as clinical psychologists or as clinical psychologist researchers. It gives us confidence in CBT as a treatment, that it's useful. Meta-analysis is a very sophisticated statistical technique, and so there is a lot of direction or guidance around how to have the method of meta-analysis be very scientifically sound. And so there are these guidelines that all meta-analysis should incorporate these 5 steps into their meta-analysis. First is formulating the research question that includes reasonable, important, and testable hypotheses. 2, to obtain a representative sample. And within that, determining and explaining the criteria for which individual studies were included or not included, including and considering unpublished reports in addition to published reports. 3, to obtain information from those individual studies, taking into account the specific methodology, maybe strengths or weaknesses of different methodologies, and ensuring that the reliability is adequate when coding the previous findings. 4, conducting those appropriate analyses, and in combining effect sizes across studies, making sure to weight those studies such that a larger scale study would count more or have a greater weight than a smaller study, because it's representing a larger piece of the pie. There's more people that went into that study as compared to a smaller study. And then the last step is reaching conclusions and offering suggestions for future research. Okay, and so all of this is really getting us to talking about treatment outcome, and how it should be measured, what should be measured, when it should be measured, and who should be measuring it. And so clinical psychologists who are investigating therapy outcomes have these fundamental questions that they have to answer in designing their studies. And the way that they choose to answer these questions, or the choices that they make, have an influence on the data that they end up collecting, and then the conclusions that they draw from it. And so it is important to go through these questions. So first is, how should the psychotherapy outcome be measured? The most common way is questionnaires, because they're very efficient and convenient, and they are some of the most commonly used and widely accepted measures of therapy outcome. But there are other possibilities. We can do interviews and direct observations of the client inside or outside of sessions. For what should be measured when assessing the psychotherapy outcome, what we really want to consider is, what aspects of the client are we hoping to have change as a result of engaging in psychotherapy? And given that the list of problems that a person could enter therapy with, or the different techniques or approaches that are available for therapists, the answer to this question can vary greatly. But some potential answers could be to measure the behavior, the thought patterns, the emotional responses, the interpersonal tendencies, the awareness, the awareness of that internal mental process, academic or professional outcomes, and others. So if a client is seeking psychotherapy for depression, a clinical psychology researcher might look at these things, like the ability to get to work, the ability to perform well in school, measuring their cognitive process, all as measures or metrics for indicating changes in depression. So when should psychotherapy outcomes be measured? This can vary as well based on a couple different things. So what we care about is actually evaluative. And what I mean by that is determining after the fact how well therapy worked. The measurement could occur immediately after therapy ends, or it could occur as a follow-up a week after, a month after, a year after, or some other predetermined amount of time. Alternatively, if the emphasis is formative, if we want to determine how therapy is working while it's happening so that we can make adjustments to hopefully help it work better, then we would want the measurements to be taking place in each session, or maybe on a less frequent basis, but certainly over the course of treatments. And then measurements after the fact, after the conclusion of psychotherapy, wouldn't be necessary anymore. And so here, the when is determined based on if the researchers would want to know how it's working in the moment versus how well the treatment effects will maintain over time. And of course, researchers could combine these approaches as well. And our last question is, who should rate the psychotherapy outcome? So there are several parties that have a vested interest in how therapy is going, and some knowledge regarding how well therapy is going for a particular client. So the most obvious source of information is going to be the client themselves, but sometimes our opinions of ourselves and our own progress are subject to bias, or expectations, and in some cases can even be biased by the very psychological issues that are prompting therapy. So one example of this could be for a depressed client who is seeking therapy to address their depression, and as a part of a depressive process, consistently focuses on negative aspects of their life and ignores positive aspects, which is a common finding. It's a common cognitive process that is present in depression. And so this negative bias may then be applied towards the question of a therapy outcome as well, and may bias that answer. Additionally, if therapy is involving more than one individual, like if we do family therapy or couples therapy, then the answers to the question of how psychotherapy is going might not even be the same across the two clients that are receiving those services. So that is the client piece here. Then if we think about the psychotherapists themselves, they could provide their own perspectives, but their perspectives are also subject to bias or other threats to objectivity because they want the best for their clients, or they want therapy to be going well, for their own source of like fulfillment and purpose. And then the last group here would be, in addition to the client and the therapist, that there are other parties that are involved, like family members or spouses or employers or insurance companies or society more generally. And so the most effective way really to answer this question, who should rate the psychotherapy outcome, is likely a combination of all three. All right. Now to briefly touch on technology in clinical psychology research, because it is increasing over recent years. Clinical psychologists are involving new forms of technology in their research. Sometimes they're using technology to collect data. So, for example, a group of researchers examining the extent to which a negative thought impaired sleep and decreased mood the next day might approach that by sending out several reminders to a smartphone throughout the day to complete surveys on negative thoughts and mood, and then wearing of an active graph, which is similar to a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, that can track sleep quality. And then putting all of that information together in this really high-tech method of data collection that's often called experience sampling, because it's getting at the ability to tap into the participant's behavior in real time. We're seeing their sleep quality in real time. We're getting multiple measurements of negative thoughts and mood throughout the day. And all of that kind of converging together is very cutting edge in terms of clinical psychology at this moment. Another way that clinical psychologists are using technology to collect data is by using internet-based crowdsourcing, like this MTurk, or Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a marketplace that's run by Amazon Corporation. What it does is it matches researchers with willing participants. And clinical psychologists are increasingly turning towards MTurk as an alternative to using a pool of undergraduate students or other easily available pools of participants. There is research on US MTurk participants suggesting that as a group, they differ slightly from the general public in the US in that they're slightly younger, that they're better educated, they're more introverted, and they're more likely to be European American or Asian American. But even with these characteristics, the MTurk population is at least as representative as other commonly used samples, like college samples, for example, come with all of their own problems. They are more educated, their income is higher, they have different privileges than the general population. And so MTurk is still performing as well or better than other commonly used samples or methods of sample collection. And then additionally, clinical psychologists have involved technology in their research, focusing on technology as its own clinical intervention. So examining how well a particular use of technology is working as a component of therapy. So one example of this is researchers examining the outcome of a parent training program for kids with disruptive behavior disorders. So all of the parents received face-to-face training, and then half of the parents received an additional technology enhancement that was delivered to their smartphones, and it included instructional videos, brief surveys, reminders, and they found that the parents that had these technology enhancements, that having those technology enhancements improved parental engagement in treatment and in children's behavior change. So kind of summarizing this slide, increasingly research in clinical psychology is incorporating technology either as a means to collect data, such as that experience sampling, or as the subject of outcome studies, like looking at the impact of technology when it's used as part of therapy. All right, then the last thing that we're going to go over here for this lecture is on ethics and research. So touching briefly on the ethics and research in clinical psychology. Clinical psychology researchers do adhere to ethical standards when they're conducting research. One ethical concern that is kind of a hot topic that we're kind of working through as a field is the use of control groups, or of a no treatment control group, of a waitlist control group in these psychotherapy outcome studies, because what it's effectively doing is withholding treatment from somebody who could really need it. And potentially at the same time also telling them to not go get treatment somewhere else because they're going to get it from those researchers, in 8 weeks time, whenever the active treatment is done. And so they're not only not getting the treatment there, but then they're being prevented from getting it elsewhere. And so this is something as a field that we're trying to work through and address this ethical issue. And there are other ethical issues as well. And so for such cases where ethical issues may arise, the American Psychological Association's Code of Ethics includes specific standards that apply to clinical psychologists that are doing research. And some of the most relevant of these standards include this list. First, that researchers need to obtain informed consent that must include what the purpose of the study is and what participation will entail, as well as informing the participant of their right to decline or to withdraw their participation at any time. Second, that researchers cannot coerce participation by offering excessive or inappropriate rewards. Third, that researchers should avoid using deception at all costs. And if it is used, that the researcher needs to explain it fully to the participant as soon as possible, and then offer the participant the right, or offer them the option to have their data removed or withdrawn. Next, if researchers discover that research procedures have harmed a participant, they need to be taking reasonable steps to minimize that harm. Obviously, that researchers should never be fabricating or falsifying data, and that should be listing themselves as authors of a study only when they have made a justifiable contribution to that study. And then lastly, this idea of open science or open data, that researchers should be sharing their data with other competent researchers who intend to reanalyze it for re-verification. And that would be, checking some of these other things too. Like if open science was a part of it, then there would be no falsifying of data, because somebody could just check your data and see if the results were the same. So that is concluding then the end of this lecture, chapter 6, on conducting research in clinical psychology. And thank you so much for your time. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.